West India Lights by Henry S. Whitehead. Chapter 1. The Portrait. I had engaged Melbourne House, a fine old mansion on the hill back of Frederickstead, on the West India island of Santa Cruz, for the winter, and I found when I arrived one November day that I was to have one more room at my disposal than I had bargained for. This was really an end-of-the-second-floor passageway, which had been made into a room by a slat partition. My landlady, old Mistress James Desmond, had moved out certain articles of decrepit furniture for the housing of which I had agreed to give up the use of that room, which looked like an old-fashioned wine-closet. I bestowed my trunks and packing cases on the floor and had Esmeralda, my coal-black servant, clear off the shelves for hand luggage and odds and ends. In order to do so, Esmeralda had to move several discarded belongings which had been left there, and among these were a large old-fashioned picture in a heavy wooden frame which had escaped the ravages of woodworms for countless decades. I noticed the old picture when I was bestowing some of my own odds and ends near where it stood, and carried it into my workroom to have a look at it. At first I had thought it was a chromo, but this was no chromo, oleo, nor anything mechanically produced. It was a paint. I looked at it closely with interest. The composition was amateurish, the coloring was too faded with the dimness of years for me to make much of it. I carried the painting into the bathroom, made a lather, and after taking the ancient and brittle canvas out of its frame, began to clean it with soap and water. I dried it, and then used a little typewriter oil on it. The colors began to jump out at me. The artist had been plainly a lover of color. My restoration accentuated the amateurishness of the thing, but I forgave the artist much because of the subject he, or she, had chosen. My imaginary young lady in her flowered muslin dress of a century ago had chosen to depict the execution of a pirate, and the pirate could have been none other than Fawcett. There could be no doubt about it whatever. That bloody villain was the only pirate that had ever been executed at St. Thomas's, except his own two mates, who had paid the penalty of their murderous rascality at the same time. And this was a picture of St. Thomas, painted photographically, apparently from the deck of some vessel conveniently anchored offshore. The costumes, too, were of Fawcett's period. His execution had taken place in September 1824, and that, too, fixed the period of the painting. High as the colors were pitched, stilted as were the many characters, there was something convincingly lifelike about the thing. Apparently this picture had been painted from actual observation. The colors, too, on reflection, were not so much exaggerated. Did one do well here to wear smoked glasses in the middle of the day? Was not the glowing indigo of the Caribbean incredible? The scarlet of the hibiscus painful to the unaccustomed eye? I fastened up the canvas with carpet tacks on the wall of my workroom where it would catch the north light. I began at its upper corners, pressing tacks along its upper edge, and then pulling it down flat, inserted others along the lower edge and up the sides. The last tack went through the arm of one of Fawcett's lieutenants, just where he had hurtled through the air at the end of his rope over at the extreme left-hand edge of the picture. A little trailing CL was the signature. That afternoon, at Estate Montparnasse, where I had been invited hospitably for tea, I told my hosts, the MacLeans, about my find, and I made it an excuse, though none was needed, to ask them to drive in for tea with me the following afternoon. When they saw it, I think it made the same impression on them that it had upon me at first. I imagined that only their impeccable courtesy prevented their telling me that I had been gloating over something very like a chromo. It was Miss Gertrude MacLean who first began to get the real charm of it. I noticed her leaning close and examining it very carefully. Suddenly, as I talked with Mr. and Mrs. MacLean, there came from Miss Gertrude a little smothered cry, an explanation almost like a sigh, but so poignant, though subdued, that her mother turned quickly toward her on hearing it. We both stepped toward her. "What is it, Miss Gertrude?" I inquired.
"What is it, my dear?"
echoed her mother.
"It's this poor creature,"
replied Miss Gertrude MacLean, indicating the fellow whose arm I had transfixed.
"Why, he's in agony. It's dreadful, I think. It's wonderfully done. It's quite startling, in fact. The little figures are wonderfully done, if you look at them closely. I think they must, some of them anyhow, be portraits, just as you said yesterday, Mr. Canavan. This one certainly is almost uncanny."
We all looked at the dangling fellow. I had not seen him since yesterday. Curious. He was not, as I had supposed, dangling. He was hurtling through the air, had not quite reached the end of that fatal fall from the drop where stood the hangman, a terrible, fierce fellow. No, the rope was not yet wholly taut. That knot of 7 turns had not broken the poor devil's neck. He was alive as any of the spectators. But it was not this new interpretation of the artist's skill, not the look of the tortured horror, which had so moved Miss Gertrude. No. What caused me to close my eyes in a spasmodic, futile effort to shut out a deeper horror, caused me to lean heavily against the table, fighting to retain some measure of my composure, was the fact that the man's expression had changed since yesterday. Now, out of his horror-shot, protruding, agonized eyes, came straight at me a look of strange reproachfulness. And down his little painted arm, from the place where I had driven the carpet tack through it, were running little drops of bright red blood. I opened my eyes and turned to my guests. I pulled myself together with an effort which was like a wrench. I bowed to Mrs. McLean. "Shall we go down for tea?" I inquired. Miss Gertrude lingered behind after the rest had passed out of the room. She took my arm, and I could feel her slim white hand trembling. "I think it is very dreadful, somehow, that picture," she whispered confidingly. "But, oh, Mr. Canavan, it's fascinating. I wonder if C.L. really was a girl. Perhaps we can find out." "We'll see what can be done," I replied with an attempt at lightness, and she smiled up at me most charmingly in a way she has. A lively young girl is Miss Gertrude McLean, daughter of old Scottish gentry planters, people who had come to the island in the old days. When the McLeans had gone after tea, I went upstairs and pulled out that tack. I will admit that I almost expected to see fresh blood flow from the wound. Nothing of the sort happened, of course. I looked closely at the place. Red paint, put on 100 years ago. The reproachful expression I had imagined was, too, wholly absent from the man's face. I was looking at the picture now by electric light. The marked differences in light effects that we get in the West Indies might well be expected to play queer optical tricks. They are a land of the imagination, the islands. Some of the original crudity, too, seemed somehow to have got back into the picture. Chapter 2. Something besides paint. After breakfast the next morning I went straight into the picture. In this clear, raw morning light there remained only that look of apprehension which the artist had painted in. No agony, certainly no reproach. Queer tricks, strange illusions, those begotten of our tropical sun. I examined the tiny hole left by the carpet tack under a magnifying glass. The blood-stains of my aroused imagination of yesterday were stains of century-old brittle paint, probably a slip of the brush just after touching in these flamboyant trees, or a scarlet head turban or so. Mere little meaningless incidental dabs they were, and nothing more that I was able to discover. That afternoon I called upon old Mrs. Desmond, who owns Melbourne House. She is a little faded lady of the old Irish gentry, of a family which has been in the West Indies since early in the 18th century. She was dressed as usual in hot-looking black silk with a little lace around the edges. There was about her a penumbra of veils and a suggestion of quaint leather reticules. She has, too, that dead-white, colorless complexion of the West Indian Caucasian lady who has spent the bulk of a long lifetime avoiding the direct rays of the sun. I told Mrs. Desmond about finding the picture and our curiosity about the identity of the artist. She smiled at me kindly, rocking herself back and forth in an enormous Copenhagen mahogany rocking chair the while, and fanning herself with a regularity which suggested doom. "It was painted by my aunt, Mr. Canavan," said Mrs. Desmond, "who was Camilla Lanigan, my mother's elder sister. She died before I was born, about 1841. I'll not be positive. 'Tis said she was a remarkable woman in her day, and if you'll wait till I'm dead and gone, I'll tell you what's known about her." "With pleasure, Mistress Desmond, and may that day be a long way off, as long as you care to have it yourself." "What I can tell you is indeed no credit to the Lanigans and their gentry, you'll understand," continued Mrs. Desmond. "She was of a very inquiring disposition, and I dare say she learned much that she would have done better to leave alone, about the doings of the blacks and all. My grandfather, Cornelius Lanigan, that was, and her father was a gentleman merchant there in St. Thomas. It was from St. Thomas that James Desmond took me, when we were married, to live here on Santa Cruz, and I no more than a child of 18, Mr. Canavan. It was in '64 I was married,
and all I know of my Aunt Camilla Lanigan I learned from the sayings of my mother before that year when I was a girl at home. There was little she did not know about the obeah of the black people, so 'tis said, nor indeed of the voodoo as well, belike. Their mother being long dead, and my own mother the younger of the two sisters, there was no one to stop my Aunt Camilla from doing much as she liked. The black people held her in great respect, so 'twas said. As to the picture itself, I can tell you but little about it. It was in the house when I was born, in '46 that was, and my mother had a great dislike for it. 'Twas I who would be taking it out of an old dust-box where it was kept now and again, and frightening myself as a child would, with the queer little figures and the hanging. When I was married, I begged for it, and I think my mother was glad to be rid of it, for the memory of my Aunt Camilla was still in the house there in St. Thomas. James Desmond, my husband, would never allow it to be hung on the wall, saying that it was indelicate of a lady to have painted such a scene. And I believe he was in the right of it, Mr. Canavan, with all respect to my Aunt Camilla. I thanked the dear old lady for her information as I bowed over her withered hand at parting. Her last remark was cryptic and somewhat startling. "'Twas more than paint, belike, went into the composition of that picture, Mr. Canavan." I called up Miss Gertrude as soon as I was back at Melbourne House. "I have some information about the picture and the artist," said I. "Come as early as you can manage it," said Miss Gertrude, and after dinner I started. "Oh, Mr. Canavan," said she eagerly when I had recounted what Mrs. Desmond had told me. "How I wish I might see it again now at once." "I had anticipated that," said I. "It lies on the table in the entryway." We laid it out on the mahogany center table and looked down at it together in silence. At last Miss Gertrude spoke. "What do you see now in his expression, Mr. Canavan?" I did not need inquire in whose expression. A baffling, elusive change appeared to have taken place now that we were looking down at him under the electric light. "Expectation," said I slowly. I hesitated. It was not quite expectation. Interest? Not quite that either. I pondered the matter, the bizarre whimsicality of it making its natural appeal to my mind the while. "Hope," I cried at last. "And coming through the hope, a wish." "Yes, yes," cried Miss Gertrude, clasping her hands excitedly. It seemed to me almost as though there were something he wanted to tell us." She hurried over these hesitating words, and now that they were spoken, there was a look of relief on her lovely face. "Your moral courage is better than mine, Miss Gertrude," said I, "for that is what was really in the back of my mind. It seemed to me too preposterous to put into words." Her eyes glowed with an enthusiasm, almost childish. She placed her hand upon my arm. "Do you suppose we could find out what it is?" Her voice was very low. "We could try," said I. The whimsicality of the proposal had intrigued me. "But how?" cried Miss Gertrude. "That's what I'm puzzling my poor brains about," I answered. "One cannot converse with a little figure 2½ inches high and made of paint. No, we cannot just talk to him and expect him to answer. He hasn't the apparatus. He's only a brittle little mannequin fastened down flat on some very tender old canvas. He can't speak and he can't write, but somehow he does seem able to change his expression. If there really is something in him, something besides paint, as old Mrs. Desmond hinted, at least we're not meddling with that for any wicked purpose, whatever Mrs. Desmond's Aunt Camilla Lanigan may have had in mind." "Do you remember that paralyzed old man in Monte Cristo?" inquired Miss Gertrude eagerly. "Noirtier de Villefort's father, you remember?" "He was one of the friends of my childhood," said I. "What about him?" "He could move only his eyes, and yet his granddaughter talked with him. She answered him questions that could be answered by yes or no, and he closed the right eye for one and the left for the other." "Yes," said I dubiously. "Well," she said, looking down at the picture, "shall we try him?" I stepped over and looked at the mannequin closely. "I'm looking to see if Mrs. Desmond's Aunt Camilla gave him ears," said I lightly. "Apparently she put blood in him." And I proceeded to tell Miss Gertrude the incident of the carpet tack. "We'll have to work out the questions very carefully," said she. I looked at her in amazement. "Can you seriously mean it?" I asked. Look at him!"
cried Miss Gertrude, and put her hands over her eyes and sank down upon the sofa. I stepped quickly toward her, alarmed.
"No, no," she cried. "I'm all right, only startled a little. Look for yourself, if you please, Mr. Canavan."
I looked, and for the life of me I could not escape the conviction that there was a wry smile on the mannequin's face. "My God," said I, and did not apologize. I almost hesitate to proceed. Chapter 3. Two Things. Well, we sat down together after that and worked the thing out. The evening was before us. The rest of the family were dining with friends and would not be home before 11. It was plain to us that he could move, although he had not done so while anyone was actually looking at him. The fact that this last change had come upon his countenance in the briefest of intervals would indicate somehow that he could also hear. For it seemed plain to us in our eerie mood of that strange evening that the smile was one of satisfaction, induced by our conversation. He wanted us to try to talk to him. We decided to formulate certain questions, ask them, then turn away and, after a short interval, look at the mannequin again. The method of communication we derived from Noirtier as the simplest possible. Miss Gertrude asked the first question.
"We think you wish to communicate with us," said she, in a still small voice. "We shall ask you questions, and you are to close your right eye if the answer is yes, and your left if it is no. Will you answer?"
Then we sat, side by side, on the sofa, watching the great clock in the corner of the drawing room ticking off the seconds of that minute which we had decided to allow to pass before looking at him again. It was a long, long minute, that one. At first I felt like a fool, but that feeling dissipated itself as soon as we had together bent over the picture at the expiration of that first minute. The right eye had drooped in a kind of leering half-wink, precisely as though Miss Camilla Lenigan had painted it so 100 years ago. After several long minutes of silence between us there on the sofa, I said, "I'm going to ask the next question, if you don't mind." She nodded. I walked over to the table. The eyes were alike again. "Have you more than one thing to communicate?" I inquired. I came back to the sofa again and sat down, my eyes once more on the clock. Again we bent over the picture.
"There's a slight droop in the right eye,"
said Miss Gertrude. The mannequin had answered yes again. After that, somehow we felt freer. 2 questions, the real ordeal of the thing, were over and past. There was little feeling of strangeness from then on. It was precisely as though we were talking with some person of flesh and blood like ourselves, with someone not immediately present, as though we were talking over the telephone. It was something like that. He had 2 things to communicate. We took thought now how to proceed. The eyes, alike, were always open and staring straight ahead whenever we approached with a new question, and so it continued through to the end. I thought of a necessary question. "Have you more than 2 things to communicate?" I asked. "No," came the answer. "Does the first thing concern you?" I ventured. "Yes." "And the second thing, does that also concern you?" This time, when we looked for the answer, the eyes had not moved at all, so far as we could tell. I glanced up at the electric light. Our lights not infrequently change their density, go up and down without warning. We have only the little local electrical plants, one in each of the towns. The light appeared even enough. We were a little nonplussed, for although I had been telling myself subconsciously all along that the whole thing was a farce, a bit of childish play, I had come by now to expect an answer. "Perhaps it's because we asked him an unanswerable question," I suggested. "I'll try to clear it up."
"He's helping," said Miss Gertrude. "He's only showing us that it was asked wrong."
I looked down at her and smiled, and she smiled back at me. "Does the second thing concern more than you? That is, someone else?" I asked the pirate. "Yes," came the answer.
"Is Mr. Canavan the other person?" asked Miss Gertrude.
I smiled again at this. If there was anything that could be construed as an answer, I certainly expected that it would be no. The answer was yes. I began to feel the beginnings of a cold consternation, but I found Miss Gertrude smiling happily.
"I thought so,"
said she simply. Women, most of them certainly, are beyond me. It was a woman who had painted this picture. Miss Gertrude hastened to ask another question.
"Do you want to tell Mr. Canavan what he can do for you first, And then what you're going to do for him in return?
Yes.
Do you wish to be released from something?
Yes, he does, reported Miss Gertrude, who was now asking the questions, I being seated for the time being alone on the sofa.
Do you wish to pass out of existence?
She nodded over to me to show me that he did.
Can we accomplish that for you?
He says we can. We were making progress, it appeared. She clapped her hands gaily. All her gravity had disappeared. It was merely a game to her, then. I had almost begun to suspect that she had been taking the thing seriously.
I thought it would come out more or less like that, she announced. Then, the poor, poor man, said she softly, and I wondered once more.
She returned to the picture and looked down at it for a long time.
Is there anything else that can be done for you?
She inquired. There wasn't, it seemed. I will summarize for brevity's sake the series of questions which followed and the replies. We were to find out how to obtain the reward. Then we were to ask no further questions. I was to take the picture home, put it back on the wall, and destroy it the next morning, tomorrow. All this seemed to me on the sofa grotesque, unintelligible. I was almost becoming bored with this seemingly foolish play, but nothing would stop Gertrude McLean.
Is it a material reward for Mr. Canavan?
Yes, came the answer to this one. And going over and looking down at the mannequin, such as human nature, or our somewhat unstable lighting system on Santa Cruz, that it seemed even to me in that mood that I could discern the merest ghost of a twisted grin on that strange little face beneath the looming, cruelly twisted knot of hangman's rope. I will bring what seemed to me an increasingly absurd performance to its conclusion. I left with definite instructions to dig in the northeast corner of the cellar under Melbourne House, that cellar once devoted to the housing of materials for planters' punches and sangaree, and now fallen to a low estate of habitation for spiders, and perhaps an occasional scorpion thriving in its ancient dust. Chapter 4. Release. My brain, I will confess it, was in a kind of whirl as I drove home that night from Montparnasse House. When I had obediently hung the picture back in its place on my workroom wall, I took a good long searching look at it. It seemed as wooden, as laboriously limbed, as amateurish, as on that day when I had rescued it from the dust-room. There were the strutting St. Thomas gentry and merchants, a lordly group of aristocrats who had come out to see Captain Fawcett die. There, too, were their silken and bemuslined lady-folk, the Danish soldiers in their box-like Frederick the Great uniforms, the swarming pop-eyed Negroes, the hangman, Fawcett, and his two mates. I went to bed. That had been a strange, weird evening. To dig under my own house, it was too much, and I had promised Gertrude McLean to do so. Promised, too, to destroy this picture the next morning. Awkward, that. Gentlemen do not build bonfires in their backyards in the West Indies. Our very cooking is done on charcoal pots, or on an occasional oil stove. We have no gas, and coal we know only as a commodity for fueling ships. It would have to be a coal pot. That is the idea I carried with me into sleep, the last thing I remembered until the sun, the bright morning sun, saluted me awake. "Keep a fire in the coal pot, Esmeralda, if you please," I called through the bathroom door. "I want to use it myself a little later." I stepped into the workroom to take down the picture. I'd promised to destroy it. I would keep my word. I looked at it for the last time under that clear, pitiless, blazing morning sunlight. Probably the nervous strain had been heavier than I had imagined. I managed to control myself. I made no chamdramadan, which is the blacks' term for foolishness or rascality. I avoided, too, by holding on tight to the table's edge, a kafun, which meant a fall. For he was not, it seemed now, and could never indeed have been, if paint is paint, hurtling through the air in his last instant of life, so to express it. The rope, as I looked at it, was unmistakably taut. That deadly knot of 7 turns of good new manila rope must already have struck home under one of those strange little ears into which last night Gertrude McLean and I had. I set my face down for a moment in my shaking hands. The eyes of the figure which we had watched last night, his eyes were unmistakably closed like those of his 2 companions in wickedness. He had joined Captain Fawcett of the fine plum-colored laced coat and Hessian boots. Our pirate really swung now. He was dead, delivered. It came through my shuddering mind. from those uncanny sorceries of Camilla Lanigan, she who had been so strangely respected by the black people of St. Thomas, she who knew their obeah and their voodoo. I pulled down the picture a moment later with a firm hand and laid it out flat on my work table. I cut it into convenient strips for burning in a coal pot. Some of the old brittle paint flaked off in this process, and this I gathered up to the final crumb on a sheet of paper. But for the most part my penknife went cleanly through the old canvas. Downstairs I had found that Esmeralda had gone after the morning's supply of ice for the drinking water with the large thermos bottle, but a glowing coal pot stood on the floor of the little stone gallery outside the kitchen door. Into this I poured the fragments of the chipped paint and watched them bubble and hiss. I thrust in the strips one after another. They curled, caught, and were swiftly consumed. Then I stirred the charcoal and a few sparks came out. Not a vestige of Camilla Lanigan's picture remained. I should have to wait until Esmeralda was gone for the afternoon and dig in that cellar in the hottest part of the day among the ghosts of wine barrels and demijohns. I stepped out into the yard to investigate. In a shed I found an ancient spade and, best of all, a thing like a mattock which might have been dug up on the site of Persepolis. These I carried down into the dim, cool cellar. With the spade I knocked loose the hooks of a hurricane shutter. That would dissipate the slight musty smell and also provide a better light for me that afternoon. Esmeralda was still bargaining among the bebustled vendors in the market when I returned upstairs to wash my hands. After lunch I waited until I heard Esmeralda leave. I watched the good soul as she walked down the hill through slanted jalousies, and when she passed out of sight around the corner by St. Paul's Church, I locked the front door and descended into the cellar. It was fairly cool and hardly musty at all. I hung my coat on an ancient hand-wrought nail and set to work. The hard pounded earth came away reluctantly as I picked at it, loosening the surface for a hole about 6 feet square. Alternately with this I shoveled out the loose dirt, placing it well to one side so that it would not run back. It was 2 when I began. The fort clock had chimed 3:30 a few minutes before I struck something metallic. It took me at least 15 minutes more before I had uncovered a small iron trunk in the corner of the large square I had opened. I broke the rusty lock with the edge of the spade, raised it, and there before me, and such is human nature that I must say I was more surprised than amazed at the very first, lay, neatly stacked in rouleaus from which the ancient cotton cloth fell away in shreds and flakes, row after row of gold coin, all the coinage of romance. Doubloons, of course, ancient American eagles, louis d'or, even a few East Indian mohurs. In a side compartment by themselves lay carefully packed in an assortment of jeweled implements, jeweled chalices and patens from the loot, doubtless, of those rich Spanish churches of Central and South American seaside cities, perhaps even from Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo. Jewelry, much of it monogrammed, gold plate such as had graced the hospitable boards of many a fabulously rich sugar baron of the islands of the 17th and 18th centuries. At the very bottom of this separate compartment, which was of the capacity of about 1/3 the trunk's cubical contents, lay flattened and stiff a sack of oiled silk. I picked it up and had to untie the leather pouch strings, so well was it preserved. I looked in and then thrust in my right hand, and even in the comparatively dim light of the old cellar, there leaped out at me the myriad coruscations of cut jewels, throwing back the light they had not known for fully a century. My hand was full of jewels, and I had hardly taken off the edge, the very topmost. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, blazing emeralds, a king's, an emperor's ransom here, in the cellar of Marlborough House. The pirate. He had not misled us. What in God's name did it mean? Well, I had other things to think of besides mooning over that problem there in the cellar with a fair-sized fortune held in my hand, and God knows how much else there in the iron trunk, gold, vessels, jewels. I spent the next half hour carrying the trunk's contents up to my bedroom in the wholly unromantic iron pail in which Esmeralda boils the drinking water. I deposited them all, in a kind of order, gold coin altogether, vessels and jewels separate, and 2 bureau drawers, turning out shirts and collars for this accommodation. I locked the drawers, stuffed the shirts into the mahogany wardrobe, placed the bureau key in my pocket, and returned to the cellar. There, by leaving open the old trunk's lid, I was able, in another half hour of feverish work, which left me literally dripping and soaking, to get back and roughly to pound down all the dry earth I had taken out. When I had tossed the spade and mattock behind some ancient lumber, closed and hooked the hurricane shutter, and returned to my bedroom to strip off my soaking clothes before the most refreshing bath I can remember, it was precisely 9 minutes before 5, and Esmeralda would not be back until 5 precisely. Chapter 5. Courteous Interest. I remember sitting about 6:30, fresh and cool now, in white drill, waiting for Esmeralda to announce dinner, with a necklace of emeralds which I had taken out from the rest as soon as I saw it, to give to Miss Gertrude McLean. I had telephoned to Montparnasse House and explained to her that I must see her as soon as possible. She had arranged that I was to call that evening after dinner. Among other matters I had been considering my duty with respect to this find. It involved certain responsibilities, I began to see. I resolved to return anything that might prove identifiable. Apparently this was the hoard of some master pirate, possibly even that of Fawcett himself. Its disappearance, or rather the fact that it had never been discovered, was one of the standard mysteries of the islands. How, if that were the case, it had got itself under Marlborough House was apparently an insoluble mystery. I may as well mention here that the restoration has proved an actuality in 1 or 2 cases. A dozen gold spoons, monogrammed, have gone back to the representatives of the Despard family in Christiansted, and a lovely old tulip chalice, filigreed, with its attendant paten all the way to Valparaiso. I dined that evening with the necklace loose in the pocket of my drill jacket. I fear I made only a sketchy meal. Esmeralda seemed disturbed. She thought, good soul, as she told me the next morning, that the crostadas of shellfish had not been up to standard. I had not really been certain what I was eating. On my arrival at Montparnasse House, I felt a note of restraint. It is very hard to describe what I mean. I can only say I felt it. Santa Crucian moods and similar delicacies of feeling are most difficult to describe. I remembered that I had called 3 times in the past 4 days. I was not unwelcome. It was not that. Otherwise, Robert McLean, Esquire, would have waited perhaps 15 minutes instead of 5 before having a swizzle served. But it was conveyed to me so subtly that I despair of making the matter clear that Mr. and Mrs. McLean, while recognizing me as an equal and a friend, were not quite clear as to what I was up to. They were not precisely objecting to my coming so often. They wanted me to know that they thought it unusual. That is the best I can do by way of saying how I felt. Mr. McLean and I conversed about new kinds of canes which were being tried out, about the labor situation, about the pink bollworm and how certain Montserrat cotton planters were meeting its ravages, about the newly inaugurated onion crop, about the perennial subject of the rainfall. The ladies, of course, joined in from time to time as Victorian ladies did, and as Crucian ladies do to this day. But the burden of that evening's conversation lay upon Mr. McLean and myself. Not so much as the overt flicker of an eyelash served to indicate the natural curiosity of my hosts as to why I was paying their hospitable estate house so many visits, but I could feel it all the time circulating in my blood. It was 9:30 when Miss Gertrude took her courage in her hands, looked straight at me, and said, "May I speak with you aside for a few moments, Mr. Canavan? Father and Mother will excuse us." I rose and followed her out onto the great gallery which runs all along the front of Montparnasse House, and I knew in my blood and bones that Mr. and Mrs. McLean did not so much as glance at one another when we had left the drawing-room. I could hear their voices as they conversed quietly together all the time we were on the gallery. Miss Gertrude led me to its extreme end, and there, in the mellow light of a full moon, and to the intoxicating accompaniment of jessamine and night tuberose odors, faced me. "I have something for you," said I, and laid the necklace across her hands. "This is for you, Miss Gertrude, with all my gratitude and all my admiration." "But I cannot accept this," she said, looking at the emeralds as they glowed in the moonlight. "You will wear it, I was hoping, on your wedding day." "But, Mr. Canavan, I am not considering being married. I am only 19. "But you will be married some day, God send, happily. Keep the necklace, and bring it out when that delightful young gentleman who may be halfway worthy of you comes along. Let it be a portion of your trousseau."
"But I am not interested in delightful young gentlemen, Mr. Canavan."
This conversation, it seemed to me, had got rather far away from what Miss Gertrude had summoned me out there on the gallery to talk about. She was speaking again.
"I do not see why you should suggest such a thing to me, Mr. Canavan."
Women. I should never understand them. This, at the moment, I felt instinctively, hopelessly. I remembered sharply that almost telepathic feeling I have mentioned on my arrival. "I am sure I ask your pardon if I have offended you," I said lamely, and stood aside waiting for her to precede me back into the drawing-room. I bowed slightly to indicate that I was waiting for her to pass. I think I may have even made a slight, indicative motion of the hand. But she did not move, and I looked down at her, troubled, vaguely puzzled. Was this the simple, sweet Miss Gertrude who had entered into the comedy of that picture with an almost childish enthusiasm? That picture! I think I shuddered slightly. She reached out the necklace toward me, but I did not take it back. With the strangest, most poignant look on her face, she was speaking again. Like Annie Laurie's, her voice is low and sweet. All the phrases of that ballad of sentimental nonsense, as I was suddenly reminded, looking down at her, fit her like a glove. "I think you have failed to understand me, and that is why you are vexed, Mr. Canavan. You see, I cannot accept your gift. I am no longer a child, you will remember, and such a gift could come only from a near relative, or... She looked down. Her courage had given out. I saw her face, red as a red rose in the faint whiteness of that pouring moonlight. The delicate moaning coo of a disturbed wood-dove came through the silent mahogany trees, and a little faint puff of the evening trade-wind came wandering across the sea, across acres of sweet grass. Light came to me then, and blinded me. "Or one who is to be your husband," I finished for her, bending my head toward her. She did not move, and I reached out and took both her dear hands in mine, where they lay like lilies. The necklace hung across her wrists between us. It was, suddenly, as though Annie Laurie played very softly and sweetly, and yet somehow madly, played by many well-tuned violins and fairy horns, surged all about me, and it went to my head like strong wine. "And will you let me be that one?" I asked her quietly. She left her hands where they were, and raised her lovely face and looked at me, all her shame gone now, and I took her into my arms. A little after we went back into the drawing-room, Mr. and Mrs. McLean were chatting quietly, precisely as we had left them. I bowed to both of them. "I must not delay the happiness I have in informing you," said I, and the words seemed to come to me with a clarity almost uncanny, the right words for such an announcement, "that I expect to have the honor of becoming your son-in-law. But assure you no one, not even a Canavan, can get ahead of a real Crucian of the old Scottish gentry when it comes to these matters of courtesy." "We are happy to welcome you into the family, Gerald," said Mrs. McLean, without the flicker of an eyelash. She rose and made me a quaint, old-world courtesy, and I bowed in return as she resumed her chair. Mr. McLean took his wife's hand in his and said, "My wife has spoken for both of us, Mr. Canavan." "Gerald has given me this," said Gertrude, and laid the necklace, blazing now under the electric chandelier, in her mother's lap. Mrs. McLean examined it with interest, polite interest. Its value would easily have purchased estate Montparnasse. Yes, and several other contiguous estates thrown in. "It is very kind of him," said she, and handed the necklace back to her daughter. Gertrude gave it to her father to examine. He looked at it with much the same type of merely courteous interest, and then clasped the lovely thing about his daughter's neck, which is like the swan, as Annie Laurie has it. He kissed her gravely on her white forehead. "We must have in a bottle of champagne to drink your health," said he, and paused to bow to me again as he left the room to get it. Chapter 6. Requiescat in pace. Of course, I told Mrs. Desmond about everything, but no information could I derive from her that would throw any light on anything. She would only say, "After I'm dead, Mr. Canavan." But on the matter of the picture's destruction, she waxed eloquent. "God be praised," said she, "that the fearful thing is no more. 'Twas my poor mother, God rest her soul, that was always wishful of having it destroyed and never daring. And as for me, Mr. Canavan, as I've told you, there was more than paint went into it. But I believe every word. 'Tis enough of my Aunt Camilla's capabilities that I've heard about to leave no doubt in my mind. After I'm dead, Mr. Canavan, after I'm dead, and not before." And that was all we were able to learn. We had been married less than 2 months. The restoration of my estate was only just beginning to be under way, when Mrs. Desmond departed this life at the age of 76. The English church was full, St. Paul's, and so too was the churchyard itself, for virtually the entire island turned out to pay its last respects to one of its most notable old inhabitants, a member of the old island gentry who passed these days one by one. Gertrude and I had come back on foot from the funeral. It is only a step to Marlborough House, where we were living until the estate house should be ready. From the funeral, to be met by a young colored fellow, a clerk in Lawyer Esperson's employ. He handed me a long envelope and asked for a receipt, which I gave him. The envelope addressed to me was one of Lawyer Esperson's. I tore it open, and within a brief document also addressed to me, and in the fine, beautifully formed, almost continental handwriting of Miss Desmond herself. I called Gertrude, and we sat down together, and I read it out. Dear Mr. Canavan, I have left instructions with Esperson that this is to be handed to you after my burial. I told you that I would clear up certain matters for you after I was gone. There are 2 mysteries connected. One is why I would not touch a penny's value of what you discovered under Melbourne House. The other is how the evil takings of a free trader could come there, to the residence of a respectable family. I shall hope to clear up both of these. As to how it was done, God and Satan know. I cannot tell you that. But this much I can and will tell you. Even before my time, we of the gentry have been constrained to marry among ourselves. It's new blood like your own these islands are needing. I hope you will remain now that you are to be married, and to one of a blood as good as your own. For the reason I mention, we are mostly related like royalty. I was courted by my cousin, James Desmond, whom I married. It was the uncle of my husband, Saul Macartney, who sought to marry my Aunt Camilla Lanigan in the generation before mine. This Saul was the only living child of his father, Thomas Macartney, who lived here on Santa Cruz and was a merchant and ship-owner in the island trade. It is because James Desmond was his nephew that Melbourne House came to us by inheritance. It belonged to Saul Macartney. This young gentleman was accustomed to go about the islands in charge of his father's vessel, the Hope, and in the intervals of these voyages he would be courting my Aunt Camilla Lanigan in St. Thomas. A young man he was, so it is said, with but little of the fear of God, and none of the love in his heart. When his father died, leaving him Melbourne House, the ships, 3 sugar estates, and a grand store here in Frederickstead, he was not content to marry my Aunt Camilla and settle down. Off he went in the Hope again before his father was well settled in his grace. And on that very voyage from which my Aunt Camilla had sought to dissuade him, the Hope was captured off Caracas by Fawcett himself. Saul Macartney, willing as always to turn to his own advantage what might betide, joined Fawcett, and rose to be second in command to the bloodiest villain that ever scourged the Caribbean. Now I am thinking you began to see light. The connection with the picture. What depended on that bitter fact? It had not been known to me before you dug it up that treasure had been placed under Melbourne House. But consider, Mr. Canavan, where better? It was Saul Macartney's property, and only came indeed into the hands of my husband, James Desmond, his nephew, on Macartney's disgraceful death on the gallows in St. Thomas. Nothing could have been easier for him to come ashore here, and Captain Fawcett with him belike, and do as he pleased on his own property. The people would bow to the ground before a free trader in those days, and the fat of the land was not too good for them. Many had their fine houses ashore. Was not Henry Morgan himself knighted and made lieutenant governor of Jamaica? Saul Macartney went and came as he wished, and even sought to continue his courtship with my Aunt Camilla Lanigan. It was that which roused the bitter hatred of her against him, Mr. Canavan, and woe betide the man that roused my Aunt Camilla Lanigan to hate. For she knew how to hate, and how to make her hatred count. And may God, our Heavenly Father, have mercy on her soul. Anne Jane Desmond. That was all. Granting it was true, and it was plausible enough to be sure, it cleared up much that had been obscure. The identity of the pirate mate, for example. But as Mrs. Desmond herself had said, it could not clear up how the thing had been brought about. Granted that Camilla Lanigan had acquired skill in black magic, and that is a great deal to grant in any such case, or any case at all. The rest fitted together like the halves of a trysting ring. I saw it all from that point of view, and I shuddered internally. I raised my head and looked at my dear wife. Her eyes were shining, and there was in them rather more than a suspicion of tears. "What a vengeance," she said in her low, sweet voice.
Saul McCartney, choosing the life of a free trader as against that of a decent merchant, reduced to what appeared on that canvas. Well, he is released now, Gerald. We released him, and he has rewarded us. I think we should pray for the repose of his soul. He is a century behind the others in purgatory.
You believe, said I.
If I were not certain you would call me Victorian,
my dear wife smiled through that suspicion of tears,
I should say, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio.
We shall have to let it go at that, I imagine, said I. But I am going to give St. Paul's Church a complete new set of altar hangings in brocades with some such idea as you have suggested.
Which idea?
Inquired my wife. For the repose of his soul, I answered.
The Mystery of Black Jean by Julian Kilman. Aye, sir. Since you have asked, there has been many a guess about where Black Jean finally disappeared to. He was a French-Canadian and a weed of a man, 6'5" in his socks. His eyes were little and close together and black. He wore a long thin moustache that drooped, and he was as hairy as his 2 bears. He just drifted up here to the north, I guess, picking up what scanty living he could by wrestling with the bears and making them wrestle each other. It was in the King William Hotel that many's the time I've seen Black Jean drink whiskey by the cupful and feed it to the bears. Yes, he was interesting, especially to us boys. Along about the time the French-Canadian and his trick animals were getting to be an old story, there came, begging your pardon, a Yankee who said he would put up a windmill at Morgan's Cove if he could get the quicklime to make the mortar with. Black Jean said he knew how to make lime, and if they would give him time, he would put up a kiln. So the French-Canadian went to work and built that lime kiln you see standing there. I was a youngster then, and I know how Black Jean, a little later, built his cabin. I used to hide and watch him and his bears. They worked like men together with an ugly-looking woman that had joined them. They put up the cabin, the bears doing most of the heavy lifting work. The place he picked for the cabin? Over there, where that clump of trees? No, not that way. More to the right, half a mile about. That place is called Split Hill, because there is a deep crack in the rock made by some earthquake. The French-Canadian built his cabin across the crack, and as a woman quarreled with him about the bears sleeping in the cabin, he made a trapdoor in the floor of the building and stuck a small log down it so the bears could climb up and down from their den below. The kiln, you see for yourself, is a pit kiln, so called because it is in the side of a hill and the limestone is fed from the top and the fuel from the bottom. Like a big chimney it works, and when Black Jean got the fire started and going good, it would roar up through the stone and cook it. You could see the blaze for a mile. One day Black Jean came to the King William looking for that Yankee. Seems that individual hadn't paid for his lime. When Black Jean didn't find him at the tavern, he started for the cove. I've never known who struck first, but they say the Yankee called Black Jean a damn frog-eater and there was a fight. And that afternoon the French-Canadian came to the tavern with his bears and all 3 of them got drunk. Black Jean used to keep a muzzle on the larger of the bears, but by tilting the brute's head he could pour whiskey down his throat. They got pretty drunk, and then someone dared Black Jean to wrestle the muzzled bear. There was a big tree standing in front of the tavern, and close by was a worn-out pump having a big iron handle. Black Jean and the bear went at it under the tree, the 2 of them clinching and hugging and swearing until they both gasped for air. This day the bear was rougher than usual, and Black Jean lost his temper. It was his custom when he got in too tight a place to kick the bear in the stomach, and this time he began using his feet. Suddenly we heard a rip in clothing. The bear had unsheathed his claws. They were sharp as razors and tore Black Jean's clothing into shreds and brought blood. Black Jean broke loose, his eyes flashing, his teeth gritting. Like lightning he grabbed his dirk and leaped at the brute and jabbed the knife into his eye and gave a quick twist. The eyeball popped out and hung down by shreds alongside the bear's jaw. Never can I forget the human-sounding shriek that bear gave, and how my father caught me up and scrambled behind the tree as the bear started for Black Jean. But the animal was near blinded, and Black Jean had time to jerk the iron handle out of the pump. And then, using it as if it didn't weigh any more than a spider's thought, he beat the bear over the head. He knocked it cold. Then my father said, "That bear will kill you some day, Jean." Black Jean stuck the iron pump handle back into its place. "Bagosh! You think that true?" he sneered. "Maybe I kill her, eh?" Our place was next to the piece where Black Jean lived, and it was early next morning we heard a loud yelling over the split hill. I was a little fellow, but spry, and when I reached Black Jean's cabin I was ahead of my father. I saw the French-Canadian leaning against a stump all alone, the blood streaming from his face. "By God, monsieur," he blurted when my father came up, "she scratched my eye out." My father thought he meant the woman. "Who did?" he asked. "That damn bear," said Black Jean. "She just walk up and stick her foots in my eye." Father caught hold of Black Jean and helped him to the cabin. "Which bear was it?" he asked. Black Jean slumped forward without answering. He had fainted. I helped father get him into the house. He was more than one man could carry, and just as we went inside there was a growling and snarling, and the big-muzzled bear went sliding down the pole to her nest. Well, we looked all round for the woman, expecting to get her help, but we couldn't find her, which was the first we knew that she had left Black Jean. It took the French-Canadian's eye 2 or 3 months to heal, and then he came to a place to get something to wear over the empty socket. So father hammered out a circular piece of copper about twice the size of a silver dollar and bored a hole in opposite sides for a leather thong to hold it in place. Black Jean always wore it after that. He seemed vain of that piece of copper, for he used to keep it polished and shined until it glowed on a bright day like a bit of fire. That fall the settlers opened up the first school in the district and imported a woman teacher from the States. I must tell you about the teacher. She was a thin little mite of a thing that you would think the wind would blow away. Some said she was pretty, and some that she wasn't. I could have called her pretty if her eyes hadn't been so black. Hereabouts you don't see many eyes that are black. Brown maybe, and blue and grey, but not black. Fact is, there were just 2 people in these parts having those black eyes, Black Jean and the little mite of a school teacher. Well, she came, and she hadn't been here a month before it was noticed that Black Jean was coming to town more regular, and what's more, he was coming down by the school and waiting round there with his bears. This went on. They say that at first she didn't pay any attention to him, but I can't speak for that as he was too young. But in time there was talk, and it came to me. Then I watched, and I remember one afternoon after the teacher let us out, we all went over to where the bears were. The teacher followed. Black Jean was grinning and showing his white teeth. "Beautiful laddie," says he. "Such eyes, much black like the black of a water bug." Teacher smiled and said something I couldn't understand. It must have been French. I had never seen a Frenchman around women before, and Black Jean's manners were new to me. He was a big weed of a man, bowing and scraping and standing with his cap in his hand. We boys laughed at that, holding his cap in his hand. The long and short of it was the French-Canadian was sparking the school teacher, and everybody talked about it, of course. They said it was a shame. They said if she didn't have sense enough to see what kind of a man he was, someone should tell her. I've often wondered since what would have happened if anybody had gone to that woman with stories of Black Jean. I know I'd never dared to, because without knowing why I was afraid of her. I guess maybe that's why the others didn't either. There was no mistaking she was encouraging to Black Jean. She didn't seem to object in the slightest to his attentions, and I can see them yet. Her, little and pretty in a white dress, and Black Jean lingering there with his beards, dirty and towering head and shoulders above her. Black Jean kept coming, and people went on talking, and finally somebody said she had been to Split Hill. And one day I began to understand it too. It was the time she was punishing some pupils. 3 of them were lined up before her, and she started along, whacking the outstretched hands with a stout ruler. Right in front of where I was sitting stood Ben Anger. He was the smallest of the lot and was trembling like a leaf. A first clip at him must have raised a welt on his hands, because he whimpered. She hit him again, and he closed his fingers. At that she caught up the jackknife he had been whittling at his desk with and pried at his fingers until the blood came. Sitting where I was, I saw her face while she was at it. It had the expression of a female devil. I didn't say anything to my folks about that. But I wasn't surprised when word came next week that we were to have a new teacher. The little one had gone to live with Black Jean. Well, there was more talk, talk of railriding the pair of them out of the district. But nothing was done, and one evening, a month later, there was a rap at our door and the French Canadian staggered in. He was carrying the schoolteacher in his arms. "What has happened?" my father demanded. "That damn little bear," snarled Black Jean. "She tried to kill Madam." He laid the woman on the bed. She looked pretty badly cut up, and we sent for the doctor. Mother would only let her stay in the house that night, being shocked at the way she was living with the French Canadian. It turned out she wasn't much hurt, and father kept trying to find out just what had happened, but he couldn't. I knew, however. Most of my time when I wasn't in school or running errands with the folks, I was spending watching that couple, and only that afternoon I had seen her stick a hot poker into the side of the smaller bear and wind it up into his fur until he screamed, and the bear must have bided his time and gone for her. Those brutes were just like folks. Next morning, Black Jean came and got his woman, and I stole out and followed. I knew there would be more to it. I was right. The two of them went into the cabin, and pretty soon I heard a rumpus, and out comes Black Jean with the smaller bear, and behind them the woman. She was carrying a cowhide whip. The French Canadian had a chain roped about each forepaw of the animal, and pulling it under a tree, he tossed the free end of the chain over a stout branch and yanked the bear off his feet. Then he wound the end of the chain about the trunk of the tree and sat down. So the bear hung, his feet trussed and squirming and helpless. And there, in that clear day and warm sunshine, the woman started at the bear with the whip. She lashed it until it cried like a child. Black Jean watched the proceedings and grinned. "Bah!" he shouted after the woman had begun to tire. "She think you're fooling. Hit harder. Hit the ice." Again the woman went at it and kept it up until the bear quit moaning and his head drooped and its body got limp. I was feeling sick at the sight and I stole away. But next morning when I crawled back, there was a bear still hanging. It was dead. The woman was a fair mate for Black Jean. She kept him working steady over here to this kill. Most any night you could see the reflection of the blaze, and it was something to watch Black Jean when he was feeding his fire with the light playing on that copper piece and making it look like a big red eye flashing in the night. I saw it many times. And it was noticed that Black Jean wasn't getting drunk anymore, and he wasn't wrestling the one-eyed bear anymore. He had good reason for that. I began to believe Black Jean was afraid of that brute. But he made it work for him in the kill using the whip, and it was a curious animal, growling and snarling most of the time as it pulled and lifted big sticks of wood and lugged them to the kill. When Black Jean wasn't working, he was over at the cabin, where he would follow the woman around like a dog. She could make him do anything. She was getting thinner and crosser, and I was more afraid of her than ever I was of Black Jean. Once she caught me watching her from my spying place in a tree. She had been petting the one-eyed bear, rubbing his snout and feeding him sugar. She ran to the house and got a rifle, and my friends, I came down out of the tree lickety-split. When I reached the ground, she didn't say a word, just let her eyes rest on mine. After that, I was more careful. Then something happened. I was hoeing corn one afternoon in a field next the road when I spied a woman coming along from the village. She was big and blousy and was wearing a shawl. I knew she was headed for Black Jean's, because she climbed through the fence on his side of the road. Keeping her in sight, I followed along my side and crossed over when I came to a place where she couldn't see me. I followed her because I knew she was a woman who had come to Black Jean when he first landed in the district. She walked up to the cabin, and I was wondering who she would find home when out comes Black Jean. "Sacker!" he exclaimed, putting one hand to his eye. "Speak quick. Is it Mary?" "Yes," the woman said. "I've come back." Black Jean looked round fearfully. "What you want?" he demanded. "I'd like to know who knocked your eye out," she laughed. Black Jean did not laugh. "You steal $100 from me and run away," he snarled. "Bagosh! You give me that money." "You fool," said the woman. "You think I don't know where you got the money? You killed—" A sound of rustling leaves in the wood nearby interrupted. "Shh!" hissed Black Jean, his face blanching. "For the love of God, not so loud." He listened a moment, then his expression grew crafty. His teeth showed, and he went close to the woman and said something and started into the cabin. The next instant I knew someone else had seen them. It was no other than the little ex-school teacher, and she was running away. I lay still a moment, scared out of my wits. Then I went home. Did you see Black Jean's wife? My mother asked. You mean the school teacher woman? I said. Yes, my mother said. Who else? I did, I said. A while ago. I mean just now, said my mother, breathing quickly. She rushed in here, right into the house, and before I could stop her, she snatched your father's rifle from the wall and ran out. I didn't wait to hear more. I set off through the fields for Black Jean's. Before I had run half the distance, I heard shooting, and it was father's rifle. I knew the sound of her volley too well. When I got to my spying place, it was all quiet at Black Jean's. I could not see a thing stirring about the cabin. Then I thought of mother and started home. Father had gone over to the cove that morning with a load of wheat for the Yankees' mill and wasn't to get back until late. So mother and I waited. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when we heard father's wagon, and I rushed out. Hello, son, he exclaimed. You're up late. And yes, mother too. Father listened to what we told him without saying a word. Well, he said when we had finished, I don't really see anything to worry about. Black Jean can take care of himself. Look there. He was pointing over here to this lime kiln. Jean's had her loaded for a week, said father, waiting for better weather. Later in the house, my father said, it's none of her business anyway. And in a little, he added, as if worried some, but I'm going over there after my rifle. The following Sunday, 3 days later, father and I went to Black Jean's to get the rifle. The door of the cabin opened and the little woman came out. She was carrying the rifle. Somehow she looked thin and old and her hands were like claws, but her eyes were bright and as sharp as the teeth of a weasel trap. I suppose, she said, as cool as a cucumber and as sweet as honey, you have come after the rifle. That's what, said my father sternly. She handed it over. Please apologize to your wife for me, she said, for the sudden way I took it. I was in a hurry. I saw a deer down by the marsh. Did you get the deer? I piped in. No, she said. I missed it. Father and I started away, but he stopped and called. Where's Black Jean this morning? Black Jean, she laughed. Oh, he's got another sweetheart. He's gone away with her. Good day, said father. Good day, said she. And that was the end of that. Neither Black Jean nor the black blousy woman was ever seen again, nor hide nor hair of them. But there was lots of talk. You see, there hadn't been any deer in these parts for many years, and besides it just was not possible for so well-known a character as Black Jean to vanish so completely without leaving a single trace. Well, finally someone laid information in the county seat, and over comes a smart young chap. He questioned father and mother and made me tell him all I knew and took it all down in writing. Then he gets a constable and goes over and they arrest the little black-eyed woman. There was no trouble about it. They say she just smiled and asked what she was being arrested for, and they told her for the murder of Black Jean. She didn't say anything to that. Only asked that someone feed the big one-eyed bear during the time she was locked up. Then the people started coming. They came on horseback. They came afoot. They came in canoes. They came in lumber wagons. No matter how far they lived, and brought their own food along. I calculate near every soul in the district turned out and made it a sort of general holiday and lay off. For certain it is that no one cared anything about Black Jean himself. Every inch of the land hereabouts was searched. They poked along the entire length of that earthquake crack and in the clearings and in the bush looking for fresh turned earth, but they could not find a thing. Not a thing. Now you gentlemen know that you can't convict a person for murder unless you have got positive proof that murder's been done. The dead body itself, which was the case here, and that smart youth from the county seat had to let the little woman go free. So she came back to the cabin, living there as quiet as possible and minding her own precise business. Here's a pocket piece I've had for some time. You see for yourself that it is copper. It's a thing my father made for Black Jean to wear over his bad eye. I found that piece of copper 2 years after the little woman died, near 12 years after Black Jean disappeared. And I found it in the ashes and stone at the bottom of the lime kiln standing there, half tumbled down. A lot of people hereabouts say it doesn't follow that Black Jean's body was burned in the kiln, cremated I guess you city chaps would call it. They can't figure out how the mischief a little 90-pound woman could have lugged those two bodies after she shot them with my father's rifle, the distance from the cabin to the kiln, a good half-mile and more. They point out that the body of Black Jean must have weighed over 200 pounds, not to mention that the other woman was big and fat, but they make me weary. It's as simple as a nose on your face. The big one-eyed bear did the job for her.
The Killer by Harold Ward. The Oath of Hippocrates. An oath embodying an admirable code of medical ethics, taken by young men about to begin medical practice. Webster's. The Killer halted at the window of the tar paper covered shack, and, nose pressed against the glass, sought to penetrate the gloomy interior. Satisfied that the place was unoccupied, he fought his way against the force of the storm to the spot where his eyes had marked the outline of a door. The thermometer showed a temperature of 20 below. The storm was increasing in violence every minute. The Killer was half frozen, yet he stood with hand on the knob, making no effort to enter until his stiffened fingers had sought out the gun, which nestled snugly against his outside pocket. With his teeth he drew the mitten from his right hand, and, with an effort that caused him to groan aloud with pain, crooked his benumbed forefinger around the trigger. Cautiously turning the knob, he threw open the door and stumbled across the threshold in a tumultuous gale of wind and whirling of snow. For an instant he stood there listening, every faculty alert. Then, satisfied that he was alone, he put his back against the panel and closed the door against the violence of the storm. The room was cold and tomb-like, yet to the Killer, driven from place to place like a mad dog, it offered a haven for the night. He was tired, dead weary from traveling for what seemed centuries, through snow waist-deep in the face of the worst blizzard of the season. Every muscle, every nerve ached with exhaustion. For the last mile he had fought against the ever-increasing desire to succumb to the feeling of drowsiness which crept over him. He was lost. Only his powerful will kept him on his feet thus far. Sliding his gun back into his pocket, he whipped his hands against his chest and stamped his feet until circulation was partly restored. Then, shaking the accumulation of snow from his shoulders, he unbuttoned his overcoat and fumbled with the vest pocket until he found a match. Striking it against the door, he held it aloft to view his surroundings. It flickered weakly, nearly went out, then burned brightly. By its yellow glow he distinguished a nearby table on which stood a kerosene lamp. It took but an instant to apply the stump of the match to the wick. He was in what appeared to be a combined kitchen and living room. The light dimmed and threw grotesque shadows on the walls, covered with pictures out of newspapers. Shelving filled with dishes, covered with papers where the edges scalloped and crimped, behind the cook stove in the corner. A slab of bacon hanging over a can of flour. A box beside the stove filled with great chunks of wood, all told of the comforts that were his for the taking. A pair of slippers, run down at the heels, and an apron thrown across the back of a chair showed that a woman's presence had graced the room not long before. The Killer's eyes fell upon the opening leading to another room. Cautiously, he drew his gun and tiptoed toward the faded curtain that served as a door. A board creaked beneath his weight. He stopped short, every nerve tingling. From behind the curtain came a groan. Then a woman's voice, plaintive, pain-racked. "Is that you, William?" The Killer made no answer. With body hunched forward, poised on the balls of his feet, his glittering black eyes never left the curtain opening. His gun was well in front of him, his thumb on the hammer. "Why don't you answer me, William?" came the voice again. "Please hurry. You have been gone so long, and I am so sick." The killer twisted his body to one side of the opening, where he would be partly out of range. "It's not William," he answered gruffly. "I'm a stranger lost in the storm. Are you alone?" The woman gave a startled cry. "Yes. Oh, God, yes," she answered. "And I'm sick. Awful sick. Please help me." "Are you armed?" asked the killer. Without waiting for an answer, he picked up the lamp and stuffed the gun back into his pocket, but the fingers still locked around the butt. He pushed the curtains and entered. The woman who lay between the coverlets was young. Just now her face was drawn with pain and pinched with cold. A startled look appeared in her eyes as the grim visage of the killer appeared within the range of her vision, and she shrank back closer to the wall. The killer stepped closer to the bed and eyed her questioningly. "Hump," he grunted. "Fire, hot water, hands, where are they?" He lighted a lamp which stood on the stand near the bed. The woman's eyes followed every move, filled with wonder and fear. "Are you a doctor?" she asked weakly. The killer smiled wryly. Then he shrugged his shoulders, as if to shake off some memory. "Used to be, years ago," he answered gruffly. "Guess I have not forgotten all I know. Got nothing to work with, though. But how the devil did you come to be here alone in this condition?" "My husband, William Stevenson, he's the sheriff," she explained between twinges of pain. "He went away yesterday after a bad man, a man named Henshaw. They call him the Killer. Right away he went, the storm broke, and then this." She halted lamely for an instant. Then, as if seeking to defend her absent husband, she continued. The Killer, has an awful record. Murdered a man in cold blood a week ago in Erie. Killed another several months ago. When William heard that he had been seen in Mildredgeville, that's 30 miles away over the mountain, he felt he had to go. He hated to leave me, but he didn't think this would happen. And the killer turned his back so that she might not see the look of amazement on his face. "Bad snow slide down the canyon," he answered. "Happened right after I came through. That's what's holding him. And now, madam, Mrs. Stevenson, quit fretting and let me get to work." He picked up a lamp and bore it back to the kitchen. Setting it on the table, he scratched his head with a puzzled expression on his face. "Now, ain't this a hell of a fix?" he muttered to himself. "Bill Stevenson's wife, the wife of Sheriff Bill, and he swore to get me, dead or alive." Slowly his eyes filled with a faraway look, and he buttoned his overcoat and drew down the flaps of his hat. Outside, the storm was still raging. The wind was growing higher. It howled and whistled around the corners, rattled the windows and shaking the doors. The snow would cover his tracks in 5 minutes. Of course, the woman would die, she and the kid. But what difference? She was the wife of his worst enemy, and the kid wouldn't be his brat. "I furthermore swear that—" Damn these memories of other days. Wraith-like, they insisted on appearing before him. For some reason he could not get them out of his mind. And damn what an old fool Hippocrates and his nonsensical oath. What business was it of his? He had long ago given up medicine. Let the woman die if she wanted to. But the baby! Curse the baby! Of course, if it was the sheriff's flesh and blood, but it was innocent. Why did the thoughts of the baby come to torture him, to keep him from making his escape? Slowly, as if reluctant to go, he crept to the door and laid his hand upon the knob. Oh, doctor, please, please hurry. It was the woman's voice, sobbing, pain-filled. The killer hesitated a second longer. Then he turned and, hurling the mittens and overcoat into the corner, he commenced heaping kindling into the stove.
The Sexton's Adventure by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Those who remember Chappellizade a quarter of a century ago or more may possibly recollect the parish sexton. Bob Martin was held much in awe by truant boys who sauntered into the churchyard on Sundays to read the tombstones or to play leapfrog over them, or climb the ivy in search of bats or sparrows' nests, or peep into the mysterious aperture under the eastern window, which opened a dim perspective of descending steps, losing themselves among profounder darkness, where lidless coffins gaped horribly among tattered velvet, bones, and dust, which time and mortality had strewn there. Of such horribly curious and otherwise enterprising juveniles, Bob was, of course, the special scourge and terror. But terrible as was the official aspect of the sexton, and repugnant as his lank form, clothed in rusty sable vesture, his small frosty visage, suspicious grey eyes, and rusty brown scratch wig, might appear to all notions of genial frailty, it was yet true that Bob Martin's severe morality sometimes nodded, and that Bacchus did not always solicit him in vain. Bob had a curious mind, a memory well stored in merry tales and tales of terror. His profession familiarized him with graves and goblins, and his tastes with weddings, wassail, and sly frolics of all sorts. And as his personal recollections ran back nearly 80 years into the perspective of the village history, his fund of local anecdote was copious, accurate, and edifying. As his ecclesiastical revenues were by no means considerable, he was not unfrequently obliged, for the indulgence of his tastes, to arts which were, at best, undignified. He frequently invited himself when his entertainers had forgotten to do so. He dropped in accidentally upon small drinking parties of his acquaintance in public houses, and entertained them with stories, queer or terrible, from his inexhaustible reservoir, never scrupling to accept an acknowledgment in the shape of hot whiskey punch or whatever else was going. There was at that time a certain atrabilious publican called Philip Slaney, established in a shop nearly opposite the old turnpike. This man was not, when left to himself, immoderately given to drinking, but being naturally of a saturnine complexion, and his spirits constantly requiring a fillip, he acquired a prodigious liking for Bob Martin's company. The Sexton Society, in fact, gradually became the solace of his existence, and he seemed to lose his constitutional melancholy in the fascination of his sly jokes and marvelous stories. This intimacy did not redound to the prosperity or reputation of the convivial allies. Bob Martin drank a good deal more punch than was good for his health, or consistent with the character of an ecclesiastical functionary. Philip Slaney, too, was drawn into similar indulgences, for it was hard to resist the genial seductions of his gifted companion, and as he was obliged to pay for both, his purse was believed to have suffered even more than his head and liver. Be this as it may, Bob Martin had the credit of having made a drunkard of Black Phil Slaney, for by this cognomen was he distinguished, and Phil Slaney had also the reputation of having made the sexton, if possible, a bigger blackguard than ever. Under these circumstances, the accounts of the concern opposite the turnpike became somewhat entangled, and it came to pass one drowsy summer morning, the weather being at once sultry and cloudy, that Phil Slaney went into the small back parlor where he kept his books, and which commanded, through its dirty window panes, a full view of a dead wall, and having bolted the door, he took a loaded pistol, and clapping the muzzle in his mouth, blew the upper part of his skull through the ceiling. This horrid catastrophe shocked Bob Martin extremely, and partly on this account, and partly because, having been, on several late occasions, found at night in a state of abstraction bordering on insensibility upon the high road, he had been threatened with dismissal, and, as some said, partly also because of the difficulty of finding anybody to treat him as poor Phil Slaney used to do. He, for a time, forswore alcohol in all its combinations, and became an eminent example of temperance and sobriety. Bob observed his good resolutions, greatly to the comfort of his wife and the edification of the neighborhood, with tolerable punctuality. He was seldom tipsy and never drunk, and was greeted by the better part of society with all the honors of the prodigal son. Now it happened about a year after the grisly event we have mentioned, that the curate, having received, by the post, due notice of a funeral to be consummated in the churchyard of Chapelizod, with certain instructions respecting the site of the grave, dispatched a summons for Bob Martin with a view to communicate to that functionary these official details. It was a lowering autumn night. Piles of lurid thunder clouds, slowly rising from the earth, had loaded the sky with a solemn and boding canopy of storm. The growl of distant thunder was heard afar off upon the dull, still air, and all nature seemed, as it were, hushed and cowering under the oppressive influence of the approaching tempest. It was past 9 o'clock when Bob, putting on his official coat of seedy black, prepared to attend his professional superior. "Bob, darlin'," said his wife, before she delivered the hat she held in her hand to his keeping, "sure you won't, Bobby darlin', you won't, you know what." "I don't know what," he retorted smartly, grasping at his hat. "You won't be throwing up the little finger, Bobby, acushla," she said, evading his grasp. "Ah, why would I, woman? There, give me my hat, will you?" "But you won't promise me, Bobby darlin', you won't, Alana." "Aye, to be sure I will. Why not? There, give me my hat and let me go." "Aye, but you're not promising, Bobby, mavourneen. You're not promising all this time." "Well, divil carry me if I drink a drop till I come back again," said the sexton angrily. "Will that do you? And now will you give me my hat?" "Here it is, darlin'," she said, "and God send you safe back." And with this parting blessing she closed the door upon his retreating figure, for it was now quite dark, and resumed her knitting till his return, very much relieved, for she thought he had of late been oftener tipsy than was consistent with his thorough reformation, and feared the allurements of the half-dozen publics which he had at that time to pass on his way to the other end of town. They were still open, and exhaled a delicious reek of whiskey as Bob glided wistfully by them, but he stuck his hands in his pockets and looked the other way, whistling resolutely, and filling his mind with the image of the curate and anticipations of his coming fee. Thus he steered his morality safely through these rocks of offence, and reached the curate's lodging in safety. He had, however, an unexpected sick call to attend, and was not at home, so that Bob Martin had to sit in the hall and amuse himself with the devil's tattoo until his return. This, unfortunately, was very long delayed, and it must have been fully 12 o'clock when Bob Martin set out upon his homeward way. By this time the storm had gathered to a pitchy darkness. The bellowing thunder was heard among the rocks and hollows of the Dublin mountains, and the pale blue lightning shone upon the staring fronts of the houses. By this time, too, every door was closed, but as Bob trudged homeward, his eyes mechanically sought the public-house which had once belonged to Phil Slaney. A faint light was making its way through the shutters and the glass panes over the doorway, which made a sort of dull, foggy halo about the front of the house. As Bob's eyes became accustomed to the obscurity by this time, the light in question was quite sufficient to enable him to see a man in a sort of loose riding-coat seated upon a bench, which at that time was fixed under the windows of the house. He wore his hat very much over his eyes, and was smoking a long pipe. The outline of a glass and a quart bottle were also dimly traceable beside him, and a large horse, saddled but faintly discernible, was patiently waiting his master's leisure. There was something odd, no doubt, in the appearance of a traveller refreshing himself at such an hour in the open street, but the sexton accounted for it easily by supposing that, on the closing of the house for the night, he had taken what remained of his refection to the place where he was now discussing it al fresco. At another time Bob might have saluted the stranger as he passed with a friendly "good night," but somehow he was out of humor and in no genial mood, and was about to pass without any courtesy of the sort, when the stranger, without taking the pipe from his mouth, raised the bottle and with it beckoned him familiarly, while with a sort of lurch of the head and shoulders, at the same time shifted his seat to the end of the bench. He pantomimically invited him to share his seat and his cheer. There was a divine fragrance of whiskey about the spot, and Bob half relented, but he remembered his promise just as he began to waver, and said, "No, I thank you, sir. I can't stop tonight." The stranger beckoned with a vehement welcome, and pointed to the vacant space on the seat beside him. "I thank you for your polite offer," said Bob, "but it's what I'm too late as it is, and haven't time to spare, so I wish you a good night." The traveller jingled the glass against the neck of the bottle, as if to intimate that he might at least swallow a dram without losing time. Bob was mentally quite of the same opinion, but, though his mouth watered, he remembered his promise, and shaking his head with incorruptible resolution, walked on. The stranger, pipe in mouth, rose from his bench, the bottle in one hand and the glass in the other, and followed at the sexton's heels, his dusky horse keeping close in his wake. There was something suspicious and unaccountable in this importunity. Bob quickened his pace, but the stranger followed close. The sexton began to feel queer, and turned about. His pursuer was behind, and still inviting him with impatient gestures to taste his liquor. "I told you before," said Bob, who was both angry and frightened, "that I would not taste it, and that's enough. I don't want to have anything to say to you or your bottle, and in God's name," he added more vehemently, observing that he was approaching still closer, "fall back, and don't be tormenting me this way." These words, as it seemed, incensed the stranger, for he shook the bottle with violent menace at Bob Martin, but, notwithstanding this gesture of defiance, he suffered the distance between them to increase. Bob, however, beheld him dogging him still in the distance, for his pipe shed a wonderful red glow, which duskily illuminated his entire figure like the lurid atmosphere of a meteor. "I wish the devil had his own, my boy," muttered the excited sexton, "and I know well enough where you'd be." The next time he looked over his shoulder, to his dismay, he observed the importunate stranger as close as ever upon his track. "Confound you!" cried the man of skulls and shovels, almost beside himself with rage and horror. "What is it you want of me?" The stranger appeared more confident, and kept wagging his head and extending both glass and bottle toward him as he drew near, and Bob Martin heard the horse snorting as it followed in the dark. "Keep it to yourself, whatever it is, for there is neither grace nor luck about you," cried Bob Martin, freezing with terror. "Leave me alone, will you?" And he fumbled in vain among the seething confusion of his ideas for a prayer or an exorcism. He quickened his pace almost to a run. He was now close to his own door, under the impending bank of the riverside. "Let me in! Let me in, for God's sake, Molly! Open the door!" he cried as he ran to the threshold, and leant his back against the plank. His pursuer confronted him upon the road. The pipe was no longer in his mouth, but the dusky red glow still lingered round him. He uttered some inarticulate cavernous sounds, which were wolfish and indescribable, while he seemed employed in pouring out a glass from the bottle. The sexton kicked with all his force against the door, and cried at the same time with a despairing voice, "In the name of God Almighty, once for all, leave me alone!" His pursuer furiously flung the contents of the bottle at Bob Martin, but instead of fluid, it issued out in a stream of flame, which expanded and whirled round them, and for a moment they were both enveloped in a faint blaze. At the same instant a sudden gust whisked off the stranger's hat, and the sexton beheld that his skull was roofless. For an instant he beheld the gaping aperture, black and shattered. Then he fell senseless into his own doorway, which his affrighted wife had just unbarred. I need hardly give my reader the key to this most intelligible and authentic narrative. The traveler was acknowledged by all to have been the spectre of the suicide, called up by the evil one to tempt the convivial sexton into a violation of his promise, sealed as it was by an imprecation. Had he succeeded, no doubt the dusky steed, which Bob had seen saddled in attendance, was destined to have carried back a double burden to the place from whence he came. As an attestation of the reality of this visitation, the old thorn tree which overhung the doorway was found in the morning to have been blasted with the infernal fires which had issued from the bottle, just as if a thunderbolt had scorched it.